7 clear signs. You've finally defeated a narcissist, and I want to begin by being honest about the word defeated, because it is doing something in this title that deserves careful examination before we build anything on top of it. Defeated implies a contest, a winner and a loser, a zero-sum dynamic in which your gain is the narcissist's loss and the narcissist's diminishment is evidence of your victory. And while I understand why that framing is appealing, genuinely understand it, because the experience of being in a narcissistic dynamic produces a quality of powerlessness that makes the language of victory feel like the appropriate corrective. The framing is worth questioning before we accept it as the organizing principle of this episode. Not because the narcissist deserves protection from the language of defeat, but because organizing your sense of having healed around the narcissist's defeat is still organizing your sense of having healed around the narcissist. And one of the clearest signs that you have genuinely moved through what the dynamic required of you is that the narcissist's experience, their defeat, their suffering, their realization of what they lost has become genuinely secondary to your own. Not as a performed indifference, as the natural consequence of genuinely having moved on. So this episode is going to offer 7 signs, and the 7 signs are going to be honest about what they actually indicate. Not primarily that you defeated someone else, but that you have arrived somewhere in yourself that the dynamic was preventing you from arriving. The signs point inward, at what has changed in you, at what you have become that you were not before. At the specific, recognizable, practically grounded indicators that the healing is real rather than performed, and that the life you are building in the aftermath of the dynamic is genuinely yours rather than organized around the dynamic even in opposition to it. If the narcissist experiences those changes as defeat, that is the narcissist's experience. The signs belong to you. The first sign is the most foundational and the one that most reliably indicates that the healing has reached the structural level rather than simply the behavioral surface. It is that you have stopped rehearsing conversations with the narcissist in your head. Not that the thoughts never arise. They will arise, particularly in the early stages of whatever distance you have created. And their arising is not evidence that the healing has not occurred. The sign is that when the thoughts arise, they do not take hold. They do not run into the extended, detailed, emotionally charged mental rehearsal of the conversation you would have if you could say everything you need to say and finally be understood. The rehearsal is one of the most specific and most consistent features of the psychological occupation that narcissistic dynamics produce, the continuous background processing of the unresolved relationship, running in the mental space that is not otherwise occupied, consuming the attention that is not otherwise directed. When it stops, when the arising thought is noted and released rather than entered into and elaborated, something specific has shifted. The narcissist is no longer the primary tenant of your mental real estate. The eviction was not dramatic. The tenant simply stopped having the hold that the unresolved relationship was providing, and the space that the eviction created is not empty. It is occupied by something else, your actual life, your actual thoughts, your actual present tense experience of the world you are inhabiting. That occupation of the mental space by your own life rather than by the rehearsal of the relationship is the first sign. It is quiet. It arrives without announcement, and it is one of the most specifically reliable indicators that the structural shift has occurred. The second sign is the one that is most practically observable and most specifically grounded in the daily texture of how you move through the world. It is that you have developed preferences and opinions and ways of spending time that are genuinely, specifically, not in any way organized around the narcissist's likely response to them. Not preferences that are the opposite of what the narcissist preferred. Those are still organized around the narcissist, defined by negation rather than by genuine self-referencing. Preferences that simply are. That exists because you discovered them in the space the healing created, and because they reflect something genuinely specific about who you are when you are not being shaped by the relationship's requirements. The development of these genuine preferences is one of the most consistently underestimated signs of real healing, because it seems too ordinary to be significant. but its ordinariness is precisely what makes it significant. The narcissistic dynamic systematically erodes the empath's genuine preferences, not always through explicit prohibition, but through the continuous, subtle, accumulated influence of a relationship that requires the empath's orientation to be toward the narcissist rather than toward themselves. The preferences that survive that erosion are the ones the narcissist approved of or was indifferent to. The ones that required the empath's attention to be on themselves rather than the narcissist were quietly abandoned. The development of new, genuine, self-sourced preferences in the healing period is the specific, practical evidence that the orientation has shifted, that the attention is available for the self in a way it was not before, that the relationship's requirement of constant outward orientation has been replaced by something that allows the inward orientation that genuine preferences require. The third sign is the most specifically relational, and the one that most directly indicates that the pattern, not just the relationship, has been genuinely addressed. It is that you have been in a situation that would previously have activated the familiar dynamic, and you responded differently. Not because you decided to respond differently, because something in your nervous system's response to the situation had actually changed. This distinction is important. Deciding to respond differently is behavioral management, the application of new strategies to the same underlying patterns. The third sign is not about behavioral management. It is about the pattern itself having shifted at the level where it actually lives, which is the nervous system level, not the conscious decision-making level. The situation that would previously have activated the overgiving, the self-erasure, the automatic conversion of perceived need into felt responsibility, that situation arose. And the automatic response did not automatically arise with it. There was space instead, the space we have discussed in other contexts, the specific, genuinely present space between the perception and the response where the choice actually lives. And from that space, the response that emerged was different. Not the old pattern restrained by a decision. A genuinely different response arising from a genuinely changed system. That difference, however small, however localized to a specific situation, however incomplete in its arrival, is the third sign. And it is the most practically significant of the seven, because it indicates that the healing has reached the level where it changes behavior not through effort, but through genuine transformation of the material producing the behavior. The fourth sign arrives in the quality of your relationships and is the one that most specifically indicates that what changed is not just how you navigate difficult dynamics, but how you inhabit healthy ones. It is that genuine reciprocity, when you encounter it, no longer feels foreign or suspicious or too good to be maintained. Because one of the specific and rarely discussed consequences of significant time inside a narcissistic dynamic is that genuine reciprocity becomes disorienting. The dynamic trained a specific expectation about what relationships cost and what they return. Relationships cost everything and return intermittently, unpredictably, just enough to maintain the investment, but never proportionately to it. And that training, absorbed into the nervous system over enough time, produces a specific discomfort with genuine reciprocity when it is encountered. A discomfort that can present as suspicion, as waiting for the other shoe to drop, as the specific inability to simply receive care without wondering what it will eventually cost. The fourth sign is that this discomfort has reduced. That when someone offers genuine care, genuine interest, genuine reciprocity in the full sense of the word, you can receive it, not perfectly, not without the occasional echo of the old suspicion, but more than before, with more ease, with less of the specific vigilance that the dynamic trained into you as the appropriate response to relational warmth. The reduction of that vigilance, the growing capacity to simply receive what is offered when what is offered is genuinely good, is the fourth sign, and its presence indicates something important. It indicates that the nervous system's expectation of what relationships are has begun to update, that the training of the dynamic is losing its grip, not just on the conscious mind, but on the body-level expectation of what being in relation with another person costs and provides. The fifth sign is the most internally quiet and the most externally invisible of the seven, which is why it is so consistently overlooked in conversations about healing from narcissistic dynamics. It is the return of genuine curiosity about your own life, not the anxious, planning against worst cases orientation toward the future that the hypervigilance of the dynamic produces. Genuine curiosity, the specific, forward-leaning, open-ended interest in what comes next that characterizes someone whose relationship with their own future is not primarily organized around threat management. The narcissistic dynamic, through its continuous unpredictability and its continuous requirement of vigilance, trains the future orientation toward scanning for threats rather than toward genuine openness to possibility. The future becomes primarily the space where the next difficult thing is anticipated and prepared for. The return of curiosity, the genuine, unguarded, what might be possible quality of someone whose relationship with their future is more open than defended, is one of the most specifically reliable internal indicators that the hypervigilance is reducing, that the nervous system has begun to experience the world as something other than primarily a threat landscape requiring continuous monitoring, that the future is becoming, again or perhaps for the first time, genuinely interesting rather than primarily requiring management. And what the sixth and seventh signs reveal about the specific quality of what has been built in the healing, and why all seven together constitute not a defeat of someone else, but the arrival of yourself. That is exactly where we are going next. The sixth sign is the one that most people in the healing process miss, because it arrives so quietly and in such ordinary moments that it does not announce itself as the significant milestone it actually is. It is the experience of being genuinely proud of something you did without immediately scanning for whether the narcissist would recognize it or diminish it or convert it into something about themselves. Just proud. Cleanly. In the specific, uncomplicated, self-referencing way that pride works when it is not immediately filtered through another person's anticipated response. Because one of the most specific and most lasting effects of significant time in a narcissistic dynamic is the contamination of the self-evaluation process. The dynamic, through its continuous, systematic undermining of the empath's confidence in her own judgment and her own worth, trains the self-evaluation to run through an external reference point that is specifically the narcissist's likely assessment. Before the dynamic, achievement was felt directly. After enough time in the dynamic, achievement is felt through the anticipated filter of whether the narcissist would acknowledge it, whether they would minimize it, whether they would find a way to redirect the attention it deserves toward themselves. The contamination runs so deep that it persists into the healing period. Long after the narcissist's actual presence is gone, the anticipated assessment continues to run as a background filter on the empath's own self-evaluation. The sixth sign is the specific, ordinary moment when the filter is not running. When something good happens and the feeling about it arrives directly, without traveling through the anticipated assessment, without being modified by the prediction of what the narcissist would say. Just the feeling, just the simple, clean, self-sourced recognition that something worthwhile was done. That moment, however small, however unremarkable in its external appearance, is one of the clearest indicators available that the psychological occupation is genuinely lifting, that the mental real estate is genuinely being reclaimed. The seventh sign is the most comprehensive of all seven, and the one that contains evidence of everything the previous six have been building toward. It is the experience of a complete, ordinary day that was genuinely, simply good. Not in comparison to the relationship, not as a relief from the relationship's demands, not as the particular sweetness of something that contrasts with the pain that preceded it. Just good in its own right, for its own content, because the day contained things that were genuinely worth inhabiting. This might sound too simple to carry the weight of a seventh sign, but its simplicity is precisely what makes it significant, Because the genuinely good ordinary day requires all 6 of the previous signs to be at least partially present simultaneously. It requires the mental space to be occupied by the actual life rather than by the rehearsal. It requires the genuine preferences to be present enough to fill the day with things that are genuinely satisfying. It requires the nervous system to have shifted enough that the day's ordinary moments are not being processed through the threat-scanning hypervigilance that the dynamic trained. It requires the reciprocity of whatever relationships the day contains to be receivable without the suspicion that something good must eventually cost something bad. It requires the curiosity about the life being lived to be present enough that the day feels interesting rather than simply endured. And it requires the self-evaluation to be running on its own internal reference rather than on the anticipated external one. When all of those things are sufficiently present simultaneously, not perfectly, not completely, but sufficiently, the result is the ordinary good day. And the ordinary good day, after everything the dynamic required, is not ordinary at all. It is the most specific and most complete evidence available that the healing has produced what healing is supposed to produce. Not the defeat of another person, the arrival of yourself in a life that is actually genuinely, specifically yours. So here is the honest account of what the 7 signs together actually mean, what they point at collectively, what the presence of all 7 indicates about where the healing has arrived. They do not indicate that the narcissist has been defeated. They indicate that the narcissist has become genuinely irrelevant to the primary question of your life, which is who you are and how you want to inhabit the days you are given. And genuinely irrelevant is not the same as forgotten, not the same as healed over in the sense of a wound that no longer exists. The relationship happened. Its effects were real and significant, and some of them are permanent in the sense that the person who went through it is permanently different from the person who entered it. But permanently different does not mean permanently damaged. The permanent difference that the healing produces is the difference between someone whose experience of the dynamic is still the primary organizing principle of their self-understanding and someone whose experience of the dynamic has become one chapter in a story that is being written by a person who is now genuinely authoring her own life. The 7 signs are not the completion of the story. They are the evidence that the authoring has genuinely begun, that the pen is in your hand, that the next chapter is not going to be organized around the previous one, except in the ways that every chapter is informed by what preceded it. Not determined by it, not defined by it, but carrying the specific knowledge and the specific earned wisdom and the specific qualities of perception and self-knowledge and the capacity for genuine presence that the previous chapter, for all its cost, was building toward whether either party knew it or not. That is what the 7 signs are pointing at, not a victory over someone else, an arrival into yourself, and the arrival, however gradual and however imperfect and however still in progress, is the thing. It was always going to be the thing. And it is here.